This is CheloniaCast, episode 56. Today we've got a really exciting episode lined up. We're joined by Mr. Rod Mast, who's a really accomplished marine biologist, conservationist, and sort of adventurer all around. He's the co-chair of the IUCN-SSC Marine Turtle Specialist Group and sort of an all-around sea turtle expert. He's also the co-founder of the State of the World Sea Turtles program, which if listeners haven't looked at this, it's a really immense treasure trove of information about sea turtle nesting and movements, and just a great source of information. They come out with a really extremely high quality publication. I think it's annual, that has some incredible photographs and information about all aspects of sea turtles. It's really unique. He's also the president of the Oceanic Society, which is a group that does a lot of just overall ocean conservation and travel work. And we're really excited to be joined by Rod today. We haven't had a lot of sea turtle sort of conversations, but it's really an honor, honestly, to be able to bridge the gap between the freshwater turtles and sea turtles. So thank you for joining us, Rod. We're really excited to have you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right, Wyatt, you want to kick us off?
So we kind of do this question with every guest that comes on. So first off, we would like to know what got you interested in turtles and what specifically got you interested in sea turtles. Okay,
well, it's a story I've told many times. I grew up in a place where there are no sea turtles. A town called Davenport, Iowa, on the Mississippi River in the middle of the United States. And naturally, I spent a lot of time when I was a kid out in the backyard and, wading through ponds and creeks and things like that. And I just was always fascinated, like a lot of little boys are, I think, by turtles in all shapes and forms. I also was fascinated by the ocean, probably because I didn't have an ocean. And then there was Jacques Cousteau on television telling the world how fascinating the undersea. My father was interested in it, we went on a family vacation to Sanibel Island in Florida in what would have been the 60s, late 60s maybe. I saw my first sea turtle. It was in a big wooden container with a bunch of other sea turtles that were getting ready to be shipped somewhere as food. This is something that they did back in the 60s in Florida. I didn't really know anything about the trade at the time, but I just saw those animals and I thought those are just amazing. And I sort of set my sights on doing something with turtles when I grew up. My father died in about when I was 13, and my mom decided that instead of spending Christmas at home, we were going to start traveling, use Christmas vacation to travel. And she said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, Galapagos Islands, because I had written a 9th grade project report about Darwin's finches. And I knew that the giant tortoises were there because I'd seen it on Jacques Cousteau. So my single mom in Davenport, Iowa, in the very late 70s, early 80s, late 70s, figured out how to, this is way pre-internet, decades pre-internet. She figured out how to take me to Galapagos. She speaks no Spanish. She could say agua caliente at the time, but she managed to get us to the Galapagos, and I saw firsthand giant tortoises, and then I was hooked. So from that point forward, it was like, I'm going to be a marine biologist when I grow up. I'm going to be a Galapagos guide. I'm going back there, and let's get going. So from all through high school and college, I focused on that goal.
That's incredible. I can't even imagine being able to go to the Galapagos at such a young age. I still haven't made it, but that's so cool. I can't imagine.
Yeah, the amazing thing about it is that there was nothing going on there. There was barely tourism at the time. So, and I put myself in my mom's position. How did she even pull that off? But she did. I'm grateful to her.
I mean, that was right around, I mean, that was just a decade or so after the major sort of conservation movement in general for the tortoises there and such, and a lot. I mean, that's
Oh yeah,
incredible.
and imagine dealing with parents. You're telling your family that you're going to grow up to be a conservationist, and that's not a thing that even exists. It's not, getting jobs in conservation back then was not a thing that people aspired to. The industry of conservation, like it is today, wasn't around then.
Right. That's, yeah, very interesting. I think, well, this sort of brings up a question that maybe from your perspective now, when it comes to sea turtles, what are some of the most interesting aspects of sort of their ecology, biology that maybe thinking back to when you were younger and first noticed those things and now know what you know? What are the most interesting things, and how has that kind of changed as you've gotten more experience working with them?
When I first started learning about sea turtles, it was just pure, intrigue, and I didn't know anything. So I started reading whatever books I could find. There weren't a lot. This is one of them, Archie Carr's The Windward Road. But most importantly, this one called So Excellent a Fish,
Yes.
also by Archie Carr. I started, then the mysteries grew even more. You realize that these animals migrate across vast oceans. Well, how do they do it? Well, nobody knew, right? Archie talks about something called the lost years. Basically, when the little babies go down the beach in the end of the sea, no one sees them again until they're like dinner plate size. And lost years, where do they go? We got to figure this stuff out, right? How do they navigate? How can they possibly get, from New Guinea to Monterey Bay in a straight line? Are they doing it with stars, with magnetism like birds? There was even a theory that they were following the sounds of snapping shrimp. The idea that there were all these mysteries that had to be worked on was fascinating to me. And at the time, I thought I wanted to be a pure biologist, probably a academic and a PhD and all that. I, at one point, realized that that's not what I wanted. I wanted to be a conservationist instead, and changed course. But yeah, there's just so much about sea turtles. And then there's something that cannot be described, which is just a sort of a visceral link. I've talked to Russ about this. Russ has that visceral link. We're talking about Russ Mittermeier, a colleague of mine, has that visceral link with primates and with freshwater turtles and tortoises. And that visceral link for me was with sea turtles. And many of the people in my community, and the sea turtle community is a very tight-knit, large community. There are thousands of us. We get together once a year, have for more than 40 years at an International Sea Turtle Symposium. I've just come from the 42nd in Thailand. And everybody has a story like that. They'll say, oh, they're good research models. There's mysteries to be answered. But you know what? I just like them. That's the thing that holds us mostly together.
That's something I think that's a really good point. I don't think in the 60 or so people we've had on that it's come up a few times. Anders Rodin sort of had the moral connection. He brought that up, and the moral imperative to protect turtles, but that kind of the visceral, the gut feeling, and the beauty of the entire organism in its habitat is something that's really it's just there if you have it, I think. And it's really, I spent some time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I would say
ahead.
that's probably the single thing that keeps people like me engaged with working with any, in my case, sea turtles, and you guys love freshwater turtles and tortoises. Anders, Russ, they love their freshwater turtles and tortoises. And I think that we can come up with a lot of reasons. And the moral imperative, as Anders points out, they're great models. They're great flagships. They're tied to conservation themes that are important for their habitats and ultimately for us. But the real reason we do this is because we love these animals. And the others are sort of reasonable justifications for why we do the work. But the reason we're working on these animals is because we have a connection.
Yeah, it's a good point to sort of highlight the distinction between why to protect and sort of where it comes from. That's I spent some time in Playa Oceanal in Costa Rica, and I can just being there. I didn't actually see the Aribata, but just being there was sort of this, it sort of a tough feeling to capture of just place and sort of in the moment and just in waiting for the sea turtles, just thinking about all different aspects of what causes that event and their biology. That's just, it's just so visceral, like you say. I mean, it is just incredible. So you've traveled a lot and you've seen sea turtles all over the world. And something that's interesting from getting people's perspectives in a sort of a academic papers kind of miss a lot of this out, but where have you seen a lot of these unique attributes of sea turtles sort of play out, and where have been your most memorable sea turtle encounters?
Well, I have to say that one of the most spectacular sea turtles do, and it's one species that nests in these enormous arribadas, or that's the Spanish for, and it's a reproductive technique that basically could be described as predator glut. They all come ashore, all the females come ashore at once over a few days' time. They get their nesting done. There's way too many of them than any amount of predators could consume, either the adults or the eggs. And then when the hatching occurs, it happens en masse, so that get past the predators and grow to adulthood. It's apparently a technique that works pretty well for sea turtles. Ridley is the most abundant of the 7 species of sea turtles. And they only do this in 3 places in the world. Eastern India in the state of Odisha, Oceanic, which you mentioned, in Costa Rica, a little beach north of there as well called Nancite. And then the largest Aribata beach of all is in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and it's called Escobilla. And I've been to all 3 of those areas a number of times, actually. And it's a spectacular thing to see. Migrations are also an amazing aspect of sea turtles. One of the best examples is leatherback turtles that in the Eastern Pacific, which nest in the northwestern corner of the island of New Guinea, way over on the western side of the Pacific, but they feed along the coast of the U.S. and down into Central America. So imagine you get done nesting, you're a female, you finish nesting in New Guinea, and then you decide, okay, I'm hungry, and you swim to Oregon or Monterey Bay, California, across the entire Pacific Ocean, the largest thing on Earth. And they do this regularly. That's pretty incredible. And the migrations of most of the other species of sea turtles as well across vast ocean basins is a spectacle that everyone, if you're lucky enough to actually see a migrating turtle or be at one end or the other of the migration, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, you mentioned the Nancite, the Aribata that occurs there. Have you seen that event? There's a little book, I don't have it on hand, by Stephen Cornelius that documented a lot of that. And after we went to Santa Rosa National Park while I was there, but we couldn't access the beach. But I'm just curious if you've seen that, Aribata.
Yeah, I actually worked with Stephen many years ago. My first conservation job was at World Wildlife Fund, and his project was supported by World Wildlife Fund, and I knew him and his colleagues, and I visited Nancite in, I want to say, the early 80s when we had a sea turtle meeting in Costa Rica, and I did see the animals. I didn't see the full-on Aribata, although I've seen that at Oceanal and the other two beaches I mentioned. And it's diminished somewhat, as I understand it. And most of the animal, while Nansite has gotten smaller in terms of numbers of turtles, and it's a very small beach, it's gotten larger at Oceanal, further to the south, although the animals only use a portion of the beach. But that's, things come, there are dynamics. And it's not, I wouldn't say that that's a conservation problem or an indication that something's going wrong. It's just that these things change over time. If you think back through the evolution of sea turtles, continents have moved. Certainly, beaches have moved. When I was in my 20s, I was super excited about going to northern South America because a guy named Joop Schultz had written a book about turtles in Suriname, and it sounded like olive ridley nesting in Suriname was off the charts, and I wanted to see that. Today, you don't get so much of that. There's different animals nesting there. There's no less olive ridleys than there were then, but they just don't nest in northern South America as much as they used to. These things change from time to time.
It seems like it. We talked to Sybil Pritchard a bit, and just talking about even Dr. Pritchard's work in the Guianas and just kind of at Shell Beach and around there seem to be kind of little shifts in the proportions of species and that kind of thing. So it's, yeah, like you say, very dynamic. You talk about sea turtle conservation. You've talked a bit about some of the life history sort of attributes of turtles that make them a bit unique and also possibly hard to deal with at a conservation level. Curious, sort of, maybe we can kind of dive into that as a topic and a little history of sea turtle conservation. Where did it begin, and sort of where do you fall into that?
Well, going back to 2003, I had been working with sea turtles since I was a teenager. My first job, I think I mentioned to you before we started the podcast, that I worked on Little Cumberland Island in Georgia. That was my first field-based experience with sea. And basically it stemmed from the fact that the prior summer, I had been given an opportunity to be a student on a sailing vessel, a marine research vessel in the North Atlantic. And we were told it would be a good idea to select a research project on this cruise. So naturally, I picked up the phone and called Archie Carr and said, "Hey, I'm a young guy that wants to study sea. I'm going to be at sea and I need a project. What should I do?" And he said, "Well, it's going to be really hard. You're not going to have enough sample size to be able to do anything, very interesting. Keep observations, but if you want to do another project, you should call my friend Jim Richardson at the Institute of Ecology in Georgia, and maybe he'll get you out on the beach and you can study loggerheads." So through Archie, I met Jim Richardson. Jim Richardson hired me, and I spent a summer working on Little Cumberland Island. I wanted to grow up to be a PhD biologist working in a university somewhere. And then I realized that there are threats to these animals. The animals were dying like crazy at the time, washing up dead on the beach because they'd been caught in shrimp nets. There didn't seem to be any way to get people to stop, protect the animals from camping. And I thought, wow, it might be more important to actually conserve these animals than merely study them, which would be fascinating. But maybe I should focus on the human elements here of preventing threat, diminishing threat. So I said to Jim, what's the most endangered of all the sea turtles? What should I work on? What beaches should I work on? And he said, well, the most endangered, the one that's going to go extinct if we don't do something now, is the Kemp's Ridley, and it nests mostly in Mexico, in the state of Tamaulipas, on some beaches centered around a town called Rancho Nuevo. I did a little research, found that there was a U.S. government and Mexican government sponsored binational effort. So I called up the guy in the United States who ran that program and I said, hey, I want to work on sea turtle conservation. This is the most important species. How do I get a job on that project? So he sent me an application. It asked the question, it said one of the criteria for the job was that you had to speak Spanish, which I did not. But I thought, I won't get the job if I don't say I could speak Spanish. So I ticked the box saying I was fluent in Spanish. And I figured, what harm can a little lie do? I'm not going to get the job anyway. Then I got the job. So I had to go.
You got to learn.
I had to do a 6-week crash course in conversational Spanish, and then pretend. I had to fake it until I made it, and I worked on that project with Camps Ridley. Conservation. This is my history in conservation. It did not. It was kind of like that, somebody like Jim would say, I know what we're doing here in Georgia. I've heard they're doing something cool with Camps Ridley in Mexico. We had data from individual beaches and projects, mostly beach projects, because people didn't know what was going on with the turtles in the sea. This was long before satellite telemetry. So in 2003, when I was working at Conservation International with Russ Mittermeier as a boss, I was offered the role of president of the International Sea Turtle Society. And at the same time, I was offered the role of co-chairman of the Marine Turtle Specialist Group of the IUCN. So I went to Russ and I said, hey, if you'll continue to pay me as a CI employee, but give me enough of my time that I can focus on these two programs, we can really put Conservation International on the map as the lead group that's pursuing sea turtle conservation. So Russ naturally said, yes, go for it, have fun. And at the same time, I started to look around the world and try and figure out, based on work that Russ and I and others had done on rainforest conservation priorities globally, I thought, let's try and set priorities globally for sea turtle conservation. And what I realized was there was nobody that was looking at sea turtle conservation from a global perspective. There were people looking at it from the local perspective, in some cases the regional perspective, like Caribbean or Mediterranean. But nobody was sort of considering what's happening. How do we set priorities when we look at sea turtle populations and threats from a global perspective, which, if you think about it, perspective that matters with sea turtles like the leatherback that can be found in every major ocean basin. So we decided, let's create a program to bring data together so that we can start to see what's happening on a global scale. That project is called the State of the World's Sea Turtles Initiative. It was called originally. Now it's the State of the World's Sea Turtles Program, SWOT for short. And the core of that is a database that lives at Duke University and is part of a larger ocean biogeographic information system. And we started to collect data from people all over the world. We asked them, tell us how many turtles are on your beach. Tell us the name and the latitude and longitude of your beach, and we'll put it on a map. And we've now been doing that for 20 years. That database, all of a sudden, now we can look and see, oh, wow, status is getting better in this spot, but it's getting worse in that spot. What are the threats there? And it's allowed us to actually set priorities on a global scale so that we know where to invest effort, time, money in the most important conservation, the biggest bang for the buck.
That's all, yeah. And the State of the World Sea Turtles, the articles, the releases, I guess, the annual review is just an incredible resource. I spent, while in Costa Rica, there's a day I had kind of in limbo between traveling to Ocean Island for about 10 hours in the house of someone that was kind enough to let me stay. I was just going through a bunch of those issues just in preparation for getting to the beach and just kind of getting a lot of things sort of stirring. And it's just an incredible all around sort of initiative, and the database you mentioned is incredible. You mentioned sort of your early involvement with the MTSG and sort of what you did there. And I think early on in 2003, there was this burning issues workshop that sort of highlighted some of the major threats and categorization of sea turtles. And maybe you could go into that and who some of the major players in that were and sort of what that led to.
Okay, so as I said, we about the same time that we were starting SWOT to get a better idea of what was going on globally, what the priorities might be globally for sea turtle conservation. I was overseeing with a co-chair, a gentleman named Nick Pilcher, this group of 300 experts from around the world that have been around since Archie created it back in the mid-60s. Archie Carr was the first chairman of the Marine Turtle Specialist Group. And so I thought, we 300 people or so, we're the experts. We ought to know, right? There's a lot in our brains. While we're waiting for the data to come in, because it's going to take a few years before we have a good global picture that's based on actual data, let's sit down and come up with what we believe are the priorities. And I had a little pushback from this because most of the people in the MTSG are academics. They're scientists. They don't want to go out on a limb and make commitments about priorities until they've studied it. And that's a perfectly legitimate perspective. But I pointed out to them, we don't have time. Conservation has to be dealt with right now. So let's come up with a list of priorities based on our professional opinion of what the priorities are. And then we can fine tune that and change our mind over time if we need to. And again, I said they resisted this, but we came up with a list of 10 priorities based on what that group of people knew about what was going on with sea turtles globally. It ended up being a pretty accurate list. I would say some lines of those 10 priorities maybe became less important over time, but some of them, the fact that we just did the list, helped drive conservation. For instance, one of the items on the list was hawksbills in the American Pacific. So have they gone extinct? Are they there? What's going on? Some local researchers, a fellow named Alex Gauss and his colleagues and family, decided to create a program called ICAPO with representatives from several Central American nations, and they worked on that issue. They asked the question, how many animals are out there? Where are they? Where are they nesting? Where are they going between nesting? Is nesting being successful? And after more than a decade of work on this, they've answered some really, really key questions and helped us to understand that hawksbills in the American Pacific maybe aren't as bad off as we originally thought they were. It's just that they're doing crazy things that we didn't expect back then, like nesting in the mangroves instead of on beaches, and nesting basically in the dirt under the mangroves. That's some incredible data that wouldn't have occurred if we hadn't put it on a list of priorities to look at back in the early 2000s. So that exercise of defining the priorities based on expert opinion was just the start of a deeper set. Every year we had a burning issues meeting, and we got together and we said, okay, number one, what are the threats? Let's highlight those and publish those. And we defined what the threats to sea turtles were globally as concisely as we could. And I won't get into that. You can find that. We published them in SWOT Report that year. The next year was, what are the highest priorities? That was the list that I just referenced. We published that. Then we said, okay, well, let's start looking at defining the subpopulations of turtles, because taxonomically, all we have are 7 species. We don't have any subspecies. So, but we all know that an eastern Pacific leatherback, although there might be some overlap with the western Pacific leatherbacks, they're basically different subpopulations of the same animals. They don't nest in the same places or forage in the same places. They kind of do the opposite of one another. And when we got down to it, we discovered that there were as many as, I think the first cut was 48 different regional management units or subpopulations of sea turtles that needed to be dealt with differently from a conservation perspective. And we published those both in an academic journal, in SWOT Report. And then once we knew what the regional management units were, we thought, well, we better apply a sort of a threats matrix so that we understand where the overlying threats most impact and least impact these regional management units. And that's a project that we called the Conservation Priorities Portfolio, which we published in 2011 and which we're just about to publish again later this year. A 10-year relook at conservation priorities for sea turtles. So I'm very proud that the Marine Turtle Specialist Group with SWOT has been able to figure this out. And why it's valuable is when a government says, okay, we've got hawksbill turtles on our national priorities list as a species we need to deal with. What the Marine Turtle Specialist Group and the work that we've done with RMUs and Conservation Priorities Portfolio is going to be able to do is tell them, okay, now you know from our work that you need to focus your attention on this nesting beach or that subpopulation in this region, or you need to look at bycatch issues in this harbor or that fishery. And that's going to allow conservation job done more effective.
Right. So the delineation of the regional management units was kind of one step, and then that allows you to have this kind of semi-quantification of conservation priorities, and then that's where it kind of leads to the conservation aspect. Is that kind of the right way to look at it?
Yeah, exactly. So now, and we can continue to fine-tune this forever, but now we have a methodology for determining how conservation priorities can be set for sea turtles on a global scale, right down to the subpopulation. Even though they're not even taxonomic, they're not subpopulations of widely ranging species of sea turtles. So now, what my future is going to look like is getting the conservation done. It's time to stop focusing so much of my attention and our attention as a community on determining what the priorities are. It's time to get going on the work.
Right. That's a next step sort of thing. So there's a lot to unpack in terms of what a regional management unit actually is and how that's kind of defined. And you're working with a marine reptile, which is a lot of unique aspects. And the biggest one I think that just stands out is the fact that the connectivity, but also lack of connectivity and maybe a less obvious way and different barriers to that. And so how are you defining, why choose an RMU versus some other metric? What does that capture about the organism that is the best way to look at it, sort of?
I think that RMU, first of all, it's a spatially explicit definition of the behavior of a subset of a species. So for instance, we know that there are 7 regional management units of leatherback turtle. Go back to 2008, 2009, 2010. The expert opinion was we have one species of leatherback turtle. It's one of the ranging animals in the world. It's found in every major ocean basin. But the experts knew the ones different, even within this one species, differences that spatially limit what happens with those animals. The animals that nest, I mentioned before, the animals that nest in northwestern New Guinea They nest there, they forage in the Americas. The animals that nest in the Americas, the leatherbacks that you probably saw at Baulas de Guanacaste when you were in Costa Rica, they migrate to the southern Pacific, down past Galapagos in Peruvian, even Chilean waters. So if we're going to approach conservation of those animals, we need to be able to define the threats to those animals where they are. And if we know, for instance, that the Caribbean and North Atlantic Regional Management Unit is very abundant, but the Eastern Pacific nesters are dwindling and teetering on extinction, we know how to set our priorities. So in other words, if I'm the government of the United States and I'm going to invest my money from NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera, in preventing an extinction, I now know that I want to invest it in the Eastern Pacific. Maybe I want to invest more in the Eastern Pacific than I do in the Atlantic, because the animals are closer to extinction there. So how do we figure those out? We figured it out by looking at tag returns. We figured it out by looking at genetics. We figured it out by looking at expert opinion, satellite telemetry, all the data that we could get about all the different aspects of these populations that helped us to understand them, and then we put it all together. All these things together are what define regional management units. And in fact, they change, right? We published them in 2010. We published them again last year. 2023 was a revisit to regional management units, and they're not the same ones. We learned more over that 10-year period that allowed us to say, you know what, there's actually more subpopulations of green than we originally thought. And so, like I say, it's a thing. Hope that answered your question.
I think it really does. And so there was a big paper that you helped with the conservation priorities, global conservation priorities for sea turtles, and it outlines. I mean, there's so many RMUs that you can't fully go into all of them in that paper. You have to list the ones that have the highest sort of threat metrics and risk metrics. But maybe we could dive in a little bit to the RMUs and the personalities, so to speak, of the RMUs that are most interesting to you, that you've followed the most closely, if there are any.
Well, the two that sort of pop out to me as being the highest priorities where we need to focus our attention are the Eastern Pacific leatherbacks and the Kemp's Ridley, which I've mentioned earlier in this conversation. The Kemp, for different reasons. The Eastern Pacific leatherback has faced a lot of pressure historically from egg harvest in the Americas, and it's also faced a lot of pressure from fisheries at sea. The Kemp's Ridley has also faced a lot of pressure from a different kind of fishery. Historically, it was shrimp trawling, as opposed to long lining for the leatherbacks in the Pacific, and also a historic harvest of both adults and eggs in Mexico. So these and they still they're in the case of the Kemps. I'm feeling pretty good now. When I worked with Kemps on the beaches back in the 80s, I really thought I was preventing the extinction of this animal. And quite honestly, we were, I believe. There were a few of them left. But we've seen a sort of steady increase, 10 to 15% per year over the past 20, 30 years. And it's a result of someone having said, hey, this is a problem. We're going to animals if work isn't done. We better do what we know how to do, which is protect them on beaches. And we better make sure that they aren't getting killed in shrimp trawls in the meantime. And that gave rise to a whole, decades of work on things like turtle excluder devices and more regulation, especially of Southeast U.S. Shrimp industry, but also globally. So those two, I think, are both great success stories. The Eastern Pacific leatherback is not quite a success story yet because they're still diminishing quite a bit. But the fact that they're on people's radar, there is a group of sea turtle and government experts that span all the threat communities, not just sea turtle biologists that work on beaches, but fisheries biologists, community activists, and others that are working on that together through a program called Laud Opo. I mean, that's a fantastic step forward. So what regional management units allowed us to do was to be able to look at the world and say, a leatherback's a leatherback, a leather is a leatherback, except for the fact that there are different threats to them regionally, and give us the information that we needed to know in order to focus on the populations that are most endangered. And the same is true for the other 7 species as well, or the other 6 species as well. There are 7 total.
For the Eastern Pacific leatherbacks, I mean, that's a fascinating story in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, we've talked to a few people in the past. Jeanette Weineken was one of them who talked about some of the biological aspects of leatherbacks that may lend them to more contact with humans and light sensitivity, that kind of thing. I'm curious, what is it about leatherbacks that sort of lends them to a higher conservation that's led to the declines that you've seen in the Pacific of up to greater than 90%? I mean, like really large declines. What is it about them that?
Well, I think it was a confluence. It was a confluence of biological and human factors. I think, and this has been published, and one of my colleagues and the scientific advisor to SWOT is a gentleman named Brian Wallace. You probably recognize the name. He's been the lead author on some of these publications I've referenced. Brian has worked a lot on leatherbacks. He's very engaged in this Laud Opo conservation program. And what Brian says is that these animals are sort of naturally less abundant than in the Pacific than they are in the Atlantic. So that's a bit of a disadvantage to them. But then on top of that, they had a pretty serious threat from egg consumption and the combination of that with fisheries impacts. And the kind of fisheries impacts that was taking out adult turtles. Adult leatherbacks can easily tangle or hooked on long lines and killed. So that sort of triple whammy of being biologically less abundant in the first place, but then also being hit by on their nesting beaches and in their migratory corridors. I mean, you can only imagine an animal that has to cross the entire Pacific. Think about how many nets and long lines and other threats that animal has to pass through in order to safely get between nesting and feeding grounds. So it's both biological and human components that make them particularly threatened.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, it's just that the naturally occurring low abundance could be interesting in terms of why other sea turtle species maybe aren't exposed to the same level. And then even just the ecology, like feeding at the surface a bit more, I imagine, with the jellyfish, that kind of thing, that they're sort of exposed to a lot more.
Right. These animals, I mean, they breathe air, right? They got to come to, they're not like tuna or whale sharks that can stay under the water all the time. They got to come to the surface. So if you think about the ecology of another marine creature, let's say, like a reef fish, the reef fish stays on the reef probably all its life. and that reef might be within a square kilometer or less, the entire birth to death of that animal. So you look at a leatherback, and wow, it occupies the entire Pacific Ocean, from surface to abyss, and it's an important part of its life cycle is tied to the land as well. It's got to actually climb out of the ocean, let a nest on a beach. So now all of a sudden you've got a really big conservation challenge. I don't have to protect. It's not this coral reef fish that, if I can find a way to protect that square kilometer of coral reef, which by the way isn't that easy. I've got to protect the entire Pacific Ocean and everything that a leatherback might happen to run into, from surface to abyss, from shore to open sea. That's a big challenge, and you have to take that challenge apart and address the pieces that are highest priority.
Right. It's a monumental task. It's really, really quite fascinating. I mean, yeah, and you've mentioned just leatherbacks in general are so fascinating. I'm trying to make a trip down to Florida in actually about a week to go and see if we can sort of get lucky and see one. But you've had experiences.
Well, I can put you in touch with you stats on the best timing for leatherbacks and the best people to go with to see them. But yeah, it's good timing because it's also loggerhead and green turtle nesting down there. There's I went down last year actually and visited the Archie Carr Reserve, which is just south of Cape Canaveral, that is, and just super high numbers. Really good nesting season last year. I think the best in 40 years or something. And leatherbacks are coming back in ways that they haven't appeared in these numbers in quite some time. So take a trip to Florida if you want to see those three species. But I mean, I have a tour. Oceanic Society is running a tour right now in Trinidad, and there are a couple of beaches in Trinidad. One called Matura on the east coast, and one called Grand Riviere on the north coast. Grand Riviere sees as many as 400 nesting leatherback on a 2.5 kilometer long beach. That's Arabada levels of leatherbacks. And that's the difference between one RMU and another. To see a leatherback nesting in Bowlus nowadays is really, really hard. There aren't that many. But in the Atlantic, Caribbean and North Atlantic, they're doing much better.
That was something that sort of prompted this trip. As I was in that region of Florida about 2 weeks after that prime weekend or prime week when they were coming up in mass, and we went out to the beach and didn't see anything. But it's just I mean, I can't even imagine seeing something like that. It's got to be, and you've seen them before. And this is, I like getting into these things because it highlights that the intangible aspect you talk about when you see that creature. What's it like to see one of those come up on the beach?
It's breathtaking. And I mean, every time I see a nesting turtle, it nearly brings me to tears. And I've seen many, many nesting turtles. But the leatherback is one that it's a dinosaur. I mean, it is a dinosaur. And yet it's here with us. And it's not unreachable. We can go out, we can take a walk out onto a beach. We don't need a research vessel to go out into the middle of the Pacific. We just have to walk out on a beach at the right time. And I highly recommend it to anyone. I will a turtle admirer or a turtle lover if I can get them out on the beach, which is another reason that I like to use sea turtle tourism as a way to conserve oceans. Oceanic Society is America's first ocean conservation nonprofit, started back in 1969. When I was a little boy growing up in Iowa, 10 years old, I was a member of the Oceanic Society. So it's kind of a big circle for me to come back and now be the president of it. But the mission since the beginning of the institution was to get people on the ocean, get people personally, face-to-face connected to the ocean so that they would then love it and understand the threats and protect it. And that's the work that we're still doing today. 53 years later, at the Oceanic Society, our mission is to deepen the connections between people and nature. Because I know if I can do that, then behavior will change. And when behavior changes, that's the only way we're going to save the ocean.
It makes a lot of sense. People protect what they see, and what they see they can understand. It's a huge, I think it was sort of a rendition of, we did some work with Jeff Corwin recently, and he said something along those lines that makes a lot of sense. You bring that to people and show them, and then they gain this respect for it. And a lot of people, don't necessarily, you see this stuff in books, but they don't have access to resources where you can see it and then you go out and do it, and it's wow. This is just, it's incredible, and it inspires.
Well, I encourage all the viewers and listeners to go check out oceanicsociety.org, learn about our work with turtles. There's links there to both the Marine Turtle Specialist Group and the State of the World Sea Turtle SWOT program. I'm at mast@oceanicsociety.org. Send me an email. I'll give you some personal, you can go see turtles at what times a year. Learn as much as you can. This is a copy of SWOT Report. This is volume 19. We've just launched it in Thailand at the International Sea Turtle Symposium about a month ago. There are 18 other volumes covering the last 19 years of sea turtle science and distribution. Each volume focuses on a different set of things that are happening globally. We try for each issue to be pragmatic, optimistic, and to have tools that anybody working on sea turtle conservation can use in their daily lives. Plus really cool maps. The magazine itself is based on my magazine experiences as a child, and it's designed to turn somewhat dry, potentially boring academic topics into layman-friendly, interesting topics that the average person can read. Think about the National Geographic example of scientifically sound but layman-readable articles, cool maps, fantastic photos. That's the example that SWOT Report is built on, and it's focused specifically on sea turtles. So go take a look. All 18 volumes or 19 volumes are downloadable as PDFs. If you're real nice to me, I'll send you hard copies. And we also have lots of interactive content on the website.
Great.
Yeah,
and we can link all that in the bio of this video.
Yeah, we will get it so people can just access it straight from the podcast description. One thing I want to, the quality of the SWOT reports is really, it's second to none. It's incredible. And so you oversee a lot of that, and also just the theme of you being involved with the MTSG and sort of the one that, you have to be the initiator and the facilitator of a lot of the scientists that have their different areas of expertise, but might not act at kind of a large scale, and they may stick to their lanes. What kind of leadership skills and how do people develop those that have you used to do these things? And it's obvious, with the SWOT reports, just how much it seems like you're releasing them at certain times, and that's got to be tough to meet a deadline. How do you do that?
Well, at this point, it's because after 18 years, it's become sort of habit. I have an exceptional team, a gentleman who's been working with me since He started working with me as an intern in the early 2000s. His name is Brian Hutchinson. He's probably better known in sea turtle conservation world at this point than I am. He's the program officer of the Marine Turtle Specialist Group. He's the co-founder of SWOT with me. And he and I and another, we have also a full-time coordinator working with us at Oceanic Society for the Turtle Program. Her name is Ashley Bandemir. And I have an editorial team, a design team, a cartographer, a science team. And all these people are volunteers, by the way. Not all of them, but I mean, most of them are volunteering a good portion of their time to assure that SWOT report comes out on time, and that it meets the standard that it's set for itself as something that is easy to read, useful, optimistic, and too beautiful to throw away. And that too beautiful to throw away aspect is, I'm sure you get a lot of magazines in the mail, right? Catalogs or whatever they might be. And a lot of them end up in the wastebasket. And we designed scanning to be not only informative and useful, but also a work of publication art, so that it stays on that coffee table, so that it remains on your shelf. I was very, very touched when I went to visit Peter Pritchard's widow, Sybil, in Orlando about a year ago. And we've been friends for many, many years, and I knew Peter as well, very closely. And she took me upstairs and said, "This is Peter's library." And in his library was every copy of SWOT Report. And she said, Peter loved this. And sure enough, every year when I would go to the Sea Turtle Symposium, he was the first person I would look for and say, "Peter, here's your new copy of SWOT Report." So being beautiful is a key component of staying on the shelf, staying relevant. And we specifically design the content to be as evergreen as possible. So hopefully you can go back and look at volume 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 and find something there that'll be useful to you as well.
Right, that's awesome. It is amazing. And you mentioned with Dr. Pritchard, and curious what kind of adventures you went on with him and what your experience working with him was. It's just such a interesting personality and
Oh, wow.
mind.
I guess my favorite, I had a lot of adventures with Peter. My favorite would have been when we first worked in the field together in Rancho Nuevo, Mexico in 1981. And Peter came down to Rancho Nuevo, which is not that easy of a place to get to, I should point out. I lived in a tent there for that entire summer, like 3 or 4 months, with another turtle colleague of mine whose name you may recognize, John Carr, who's probably the world's expert on the genus Rhinoclemys, from Louisiana, published a number of things on freshwater turtles and tortoises. John Carr and I lived in a tent together on a beach which barely had running water. Thatched roof hut where they cooked food for us. And another turtle guy from Texas named Thane Wibbles does a lot of work with Diamondbacks still, and Kemp's Ridleys, was working as a consultant to KUHT TV in Houston, and they were going to come down and make a movie about the Kemp's Ridley. So they brought down their production team, and naturally Peter came down because he was going to be the David Attenborough figure of this movie called The Heartbreak Turtle. And so weeks, sharing a small camp with Peter, talking about turtles, just hanging out and, cooking our own meals. And that's, I think, is probably the time that we became closest. And it was that experience that I realized that this guy's a walking encyclopedia. There's nothing there's nothing that I can ask that he doesn't have an answer to, or know the person that does have the answer to. And so he was my close friend, guru, on speed dial for decades after that, until he died. And just for instance, like I was in Spain once on vacation in Salamanca, and I was walking around the campus of what is probably the world's first university. And as I'm walking around this beautiful campus and looking at the architecture and stuff like that, I see a guy come out one door and head for another one between two buildings with a big tray of what looked like turtles. Of course, everything looks like a turtle at a distance to me. So I went up to this guy and said, "What is that? Are those turtles?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm an expert in fossil turtles, and I'm moving these to the collection." And I said, "Fossil turtles, do you know Peter Pritchard?" And he said, "Oh, of course, Peter Pritchard's one of my close." And there went 2 days in Spain. The connections that Peter had in the turtle world were, there just wasn't anybody that was working professionally that didn't work or know of or was influenced by Peter Pritchard. So it was a very, but of course he'll always remain a mentor to us. But I have to say that in the production of SWOT over the years, and Peter and I did a number of articles together, I miss him the most when something comes up and I don't know the answer, and I don't know who to call. And we got to solve our own prisoner around to push us in the right direction.
That's a really interesting, the perspective on that, and just kind of, what it means with sort of the significance of his loss in that respect is just, it's unfortunate to hear, but everyone we've talked to, has said something very similar to the walking encyclopedia, but also just the connections. When we spoke with Mrs. Pritchard, and just hearing the stories of, they were on a beach somewhere in Europe and someone came running up to them because he was a legend and just in sea turtles. And the impact he had prior to the internet is really incredible. It's something that a lot of people, there's a lot of attributes that people should sort of strive, I think, to be like. But maybe we could return.
Yeah. And you asked about leadership. You asked about leadership. He's a good example of what it takes, and that is he was a connector. I try to be a connector. He was a nice guy. I try to be a nice guy. He had his passion for sea turtles on his sleeve. Everyone could see it. He was not embarrassed about it. He didn't try to be anything else other than Peter, the man who knows all there is to know, and he wasn't arrogant about it. I try to model my leadership on what I've learned from Peter and Russ and other people like that, which is, stay passionate, stay optimistic. These conservation problems are really just challenges that we have to confront, and we'll get there.
That's awesome. Yeah, just the synthesis of so many things, and just thinking about however all these different great minds in conservation of, that's great. Maybe we can return back to the RMUs briefly and just highlight something. In the large paper on it, there was sort of a metric that you don't see this in all cases, but there was a metric of uncertainty and what isn't known. Maybe you could speak to what are some of the major areas at maybe the RMU level, or just at sea turtle conservation in general, and sort of areas for research and where future research is kind of necessary.
Okay. Yeah. As I mentioned, this understanding the conservation priorities is a dynamic process that will evolve over time. We've set the stage by defining regional management units, and we provided a tool through our conservation priorities portfolio to help continue to fine tune the priorities as we go. But there's a lot of stuff, particularly the magnitude of threats and the long-term nature of some threats. Better understand. One of them is obviously climate change, and that it's not just for sea turtles. It's probably even more pronounced for freshwater turtles and tortoises as a threat, because they have smaller habitats, and as habitats disappear or shift latitudinally as a result of climate change, freshwater turtles and tortoises are going to feel it. Same with sea turtles. A lot of the ocean conservation community is focused on marine protected areas. And there's a whole 30 by 30 effort that's backed by nations and others to protect more ocean, to protect more marine habitats. That would include sea turtle beaches, for instance. But if we protect, let's say we pick a beach like the Archie Carr Reserve in Florida, where they limit beach traffic, they limit the impacts of light pollution, they limit beachfront development. They effectively protect the beach for nesting turtles. That's great, right? But that Archie Carr Reserve has a north end and it has a south end. It has limits. Well, what if climate change moves the latitudinal appropriateness for nesting areas? Is it going to move it north? Is it going to move it south? If it moves it north, is there any beach to move it to, or is it already developed? We need to be looking at adaptation. So predicting what climate change is going, how it's going to impact the nesting beaches, and plan for that. And as I say, this is probably even more important an issue in freshwater turtles and tortoises than it is with sea turtles. But it's still an issue. The other one is plastic pollution. Not just plastic, but pollution in general, toxics. Very few people are looking at the invisible chemicals that are in the world's waters and what they're doing. We already know that has a big impact, sometimes at the cellular level. Endocrine disruptors can affect breeding cycles and things of that nature. Endocrine disruptors and other types of probably responsible for the higher levels of deformities in amphibians, things like that. What are those impacts going to be on turtles and on everything else in nature? We've got to keep a close eye on some of these more insidious scale systemic threats. That protection, quite honestly, even if we hit a goal of 30% of the world's oceans protected by 2030, that's not going to keep the water from warming up or becoming more acidic or becoming filled with plastic pollution. We've got to look beyond just protected area establishment to defining and attacking systemic threats.
Right, sort of holistically. So maybe just to kind of wrap things up and sort of tie it all together, why should people care about sea turtle conservation, and what a lot of times I think people look for benefit to themselves. That's sort of a characteristic. What benefit is there to humanity?
Well, as my friend Sylvia Earle likes to say, no ocean, no us. We depend on the ocean for 1 out of every breaths of oxygen that we take. We depend on it for a livable climate. We depend on it for food. We depend on it for everything. If the ocean dies, we're going to go with it, and most of life is also. Sea turtles are a part of that big ocean picture. And while the absence of a population of sea turtles may not be the end of the world, the absence of the ocean will be the end of the world. So it's our idea, it's our imperative to get the stories out there as best we can to get people to change their behaviors. If you ask an ocean scientist along with the ocean, they might tell you that it's a list of 100 or more different things, from acidification to coral loss, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in essence, there's only two things wrong with the ocean, and it's the stuff that we put in it and the stuff that we take out. The solutions are not about studying the ocean. The solutions are about changing human behavior. Sea turtles are widely loved, and they help us tell the stories that will ultimately change human behavior. That's what we're trying to do at Oceanic Society. We have a program called Blue Habits that's specifically looking at the social science of behavior change. We're tying this to our sea turtle work. And our ultimate goal is to create a more oceanic society where people like you and me and everybody else that we know thinks twice about single-use plastic, thinks twice about carbon generating transport as opposed to lesser carbon generating transport. We think about, we need to start thinking about all the little things we do daily that influence the ocean, because when it's gone, it's gone. And so that's, I think, my key message here is that life without the ocean is impossible. Sea turtles help us tell the story that ultimately has to change human behavior. I encourage people to look at every one of their behaviors and think about how they can do it with less of an impact. And then lastly, I just want to comment on the importance of and wonder and our ability to walk out onto a beach in Florida and see a living dinosaur. We don't want that. We want our kids and our grandkids to be able to do that. And so, yeah, the turtles need to exist for their own sake, but also for ours.
Right. I think that's a good place. And there's sort of a few more just, I guess, rapid fire questions just about your experiences that we're curious about. And as someone that's as well traveled as you and has seen so much, you must have some really fascinating stories. But I'm curious what everything you've done, what the most memorable trip has been, or the most memorable experience, and why.
Wow. I might answer it differently on another day or in another time, but right now, as we're talking about sea turtles, I'm working on a book, a coffee table book with a colleague of mine from Galapagos. Her name is Twee de Roy. She's a pretty well-known wildlife photographer. And I helped her set up a trip to Escovilla in Oaxaca, Mexico, to go see the Arrabada. I took an employee of mine, Ashley, down there, and Twee and Ashley and I set out to photograph the Arrabada. And we got there a few days early, and it hadn't started yet. We knew it was coming. We didn't know when. Could be 3, 4, 5, 6 days. We thought, well, we'll hang around and see what else we can take photographs of in the meantime. Now, before an Arrabada, the females tend to gather offshore, and based on some sort of cue, and we don't know what that cue is, then they all start nesting. But we thought, well, let's get a boat and go snorkel offshore and see what's happening out there. So we did that, and I have to say that was one of the most memorable turtle experiences of my life, was to be, floating on the surface and looking down into this deep blue sea full of life, just full of little jellies of countless forms and sizes and shapes. And coming up and down, and coming up and looking at us and going back down. And we spent probably 3 hours out there just snorkeling around. And I'll never forget it. So if I had to pick one amazing turtle experience right now, that would be it.
That's awesome. And then maybe just more broadly, this could be sea turtle related or anything. What's the most interesting wildlife spectacle or just wildlife encounter that you've had?
Wow, there's a, I've done a lot. I've been to 181 countries and territories. I used to lead a travel program. I still lead tours all over the world, and a lot of them go to see really spectacular things. So I've been able to tick off my life list things like Face to Face with Mountain Gorillas.
Wow.
Big game in Africa, and virtually, except for the flatback turtle, which I still have to see. But I want to give a plug to the invertebrates, because a couple of the most spectacular things I've ever seen, and I would do again in a minute, include the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacan, Mexico, which occurs in March, April, May. I think it's happening right outside of north of Mexico City, outside of Morelia, near a little town called Pátzcuaro, and another little town called Tzintzuntzan. Very cute little colonial towns, and seeing billions, and I'm talking billions, of monarch butterflies clinging to these oyamel pines, to the point where there are so many of them that they can break the branches off. That's spectacular.
Wow.
So go do that, everybody. And then another, again, but a plug for the invertebrates. You got to experience the 17 or 13-year cicada emergence, which happens right in my own backyard. And to think about the biology and the rhythms behind an animal that can base its reproduction on a 13 or a 17-year cycle and emerge. It's, first of all, it's deafening. There's bugs everywhere, and it's just mind-blowing. Much like the monarch butterfly overwintering spectacle in Mexico. And then again, I with the invertebrates, we think leatherback turtles are amazing because they've had 100 million years on Earth, pretty much unchanged. There's those shoe crabs in Delaware Bay. They've been on Earth for like 500 million years, virtually unchanged. And you can walk right out on Slaughter Beach north of Rehoboth, and if the moon is right and the tide is right, you can see something that looks an awful lot like an olive Ridley arabata, but with basketball-sized horseshoe crabs, and that's a pretty spectacular thing to see as well.
Yeah,
so those are my points for the invertebrates.
Yeah, every year, Jack Thompson, who's another host on this podcast, he wasn't here to make it today, but me and him, he grew up like right down the street from me, where we've been best friends since high school. We every year during breeding season, we go down to the beach and we'll flip over and aid all the horseshoe crabs that get stuck, because there's hundreds of them and they get buried under each other. And it's just such a unique and amazing thing to experience every year. And that's one of the and as eager as I am to move down south, I am going to miss that a lot about the Northeast is the horse breeding season.
Any of those, in fact, there's a great book out. Again, if you're really nice, I'll send you a copy, because I have a bunch, called Wildlife Spectacles, that both Russ Mittermeier and I were co-authors of. And we talk specifically about spectacles of wildlife that include things like the olive Ridley arabata, the monarch overwintering, the Christmas crabs, things like that.
Yeah, I'd be super interested in that.
That's awesome. Well, we can wrap things up in a second. One more quick thing. This sort of ties all the travel stuff together. I'm sure that, 181 countries, there's no way that all of those have been smooth trips. And I'm curious if you have one travel story that stands out in terms of chaos.
I once had my brand new digital Nikon camera body that cost $4,500, along with my passport, elaborately stolen from me by a gang of people in Swakopmund, Namibia. And the company paid for the camera, and I had been told, protect this with your life because it cost a fortune. So I used my local connections to go to the black market and buy my camera back from these thieves that didn't know. It was early. It was a D1X. It was the first Nikon digital professional camera, and I'm sure that they had no idea that it was, a $4,500 camera. They probably thought it was just an SLR, and they couldn't make it work. So I sneakily bought it back from them on the black market. And at the same time, I had to get my passport reissued by the embassy in the capital before I could leave the country. And I was on a deadline. I had to be back in South Africa to meet a group of tourists in like 2 days. And I had to talk my way into a brand new passport without having any other ID on me, and I managed to get it done.
That's impressive. You got to be crafty, That's,
Yeah.
Well, okay. Our last question we like to ask is, we ask this to everyone, and if there's one piece of advice, or maybe more than one piece, but just what advice would you give to someone who's looking to make turtle research or conservation a career?
Volunteer. I've always worked in nonprofits. Nonprofit jobs don't come up that often. If all you ever do is look at the job boards of the nonprofits where you think you might be willing to work, chances are you're not going to find a job that way. Many of those job announcements are announcements for jobs that have already been determined who's going to get it, and they have to tell the public because it's part of the law. But nonprofits also, one thing they typically lack is money and manpower. So if you go to the people that you want to work with and say, I'm here, I will work for free, they will probably take you. And guess what? Getting a job in conservation is about being in the right place at the right time. And that act will put you in the right place. Then you just have to make yourself invaluable. Some of Brian, who I mentioned earlier, Brian Hutchinson, started work that way. He said, I want to work in conservation. I said, I don't have any money or a job for you, but come and work for me and we'll figure it out. If you make yourself invaluable, we'll figure it out. He's been working with me for more than 20 years now. And I can tell you that I've made that come true for half a dozen or more people over the years. So that would be my advice. Be willing to demonstrate your sacrifice by volunteering with the people that you most want to work with, doing the thing that you most want to do. Be patient and then make yourself invaluable.
That's really interesting advice. That's very different than what we've heard before from other people. So that's cool to hear.
Yeah,
I like it.
I'd be curious to hear what the other people say. But if the answer to that is, oh no, I can't afford to, then maybe you don't have enough passion.
Wow.
Yeah.
I like that.
I mean, everyone has sort of a different take on it, but that's a really a good one. I think we'll take it to heart for sure, and for listeners out there. Well, at the end we do a little turtle trivia, but if you have to go, we can.
Oh no, I love turtle trivia. Let's hear it.
Okay, well, I don't know if you've got some random turtle trivia facts or something if you want to throw our way and quiz us, or we could do something for you. However you want to.
How about we talk about turtle common names?
Okay. Common name. Okay.
In different languages.
Okay, this could be good. You've got some? Do you have a question, or should we throw one your way?
Well, yeah.
Okay, well, on the topic of turtle names in different languages, okay, well, there's one that pops into my mind. Well, okay. I did some work in Madagascar when I was in 8th grade. Actually, it was kind of a crazy, really wild experience. I don't know how well. It just all happened pretty quick with the tortoises there. And I'd ask about what the Malagasy name for the tortoises, but
Anganuk. Anganuk is the Chelonia. That's the most.
There you go. Yeah.
The side neck, the Erimnicheles madagascariensis is Rere.
There you go.
I can't remember the others, but my Malagasy isn't half bad for a guy who hasn't been there for 20 years. But I worked a good deal in Madagascar as well.
That's pretty good.
Here's one for you. What is a tinglado? And where do they call it that?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's almost a linguistics thing. I mean, I would,
right.
I guess I don't think it's anything to do with Oceanic, because I don't recall them saying that there, but I can narrow it down to not Oceanic, but that's 100.
Well, here I'll tell you what, it's a species that you might see at Oceanic.
Okay, that's a good one.
It's black and big.
Oh, is it leatherback in?
Right. It's tinglado is the name for leatherback that's used in Puerto Rico and Cuba for some reason.
Oh,
okay.
Very cool.
Yeah. In Costa Rica they would call it a baula.
Baula, yeah, that's what I heard there. Yeah, but that's
in northern Colombia, they would call it a cana, which sounds like canal, which means channel. And if you think about it, a leatherback has those channels on its back.
Yeah.
Tortuga cana is a leatherback. And let me think if I can come up with any other. Oh, in Mexico, the same animal is called laúd. Costa Rica, baula. Tinglado. Siete filos is another name for it, which means 7 peaks, because they have the 7 peaks on their back. It's just always been interesting to me that in such a small region, say the Caribbean and Central America, you've got at least 5-6 different names for the same animal.
That brings to mind one quick thing. I mean, just working with different locals and people. I think I read an article in the past, and the Loth in Mexico, they actually have almost a legal status. And your experience maybe working with different communities and seeing how they do conservation, when a lot of times they're also utilizing the resource of the turtles, is that, I mean, how do those names reflect how the animal sort of fits into different cultures? Is that?
Oh, oftentimes animals that don't have any use don't even get a name. It's just fresh with the freshwater turtles and tortoises. All my life I've been traveling through remote areas, and I'll say, what's this one named? And they'll say, that one doesn't have a name. And I'm like, why? And they said, it doesn't have any value. We don't eat it. The same is true for instance, for bats. The common name for bats throughout Latin America, even though there are hundreds of species, is usually just murciélago, because people don't eat them, they don't need them. If anything, they consider them a pest. But if you've got something that's particularly useful and particularly edible or fearsome, like a jaguar or there's an animal called a agouti that people love to eat in Latin America. Those have hundreds of names, depending on what community you're in. And so I think a lot of animals end up with with names that have to do with their value, or no name at all if they have no perceived human value. And as far as Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, all species of sea turtle are legally protected, and I think that's the case in most Latin American countries. This goes back even as far as the 60s. I know, for instance, that where I studied in northern Colombia, all sea turtles were protected by law from any kind of exploitation. And but that doesn't mean that exploitation didn't occur. That was actually the focus of my study, was understanding what exploitation was happening and why. You know, having a law doesn't necessarily mean that the law is enforced or taken seriously. And the last time I checked, you can still buy hawksbill turtle jewelry on the street in major cities on the coast of northern Caribbean Mexico, or Caribbean Colombia, that is. Probably Mexico too. Sometimes it's very difficult to ensure that laws are fully enforced. Having the law is the first step, of course, but then making it a reality is an entirely different thing sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and that's I mean, that's an interesting thing about what's in a name and what that sort of denotes. Well, I think that's a good place to sort of to end on, and we're just really grateful for your time and sitting down with us. I think that was a really interesting conversation in a lot of ways, and just hearing your experiences is really inspiring. So thank you, Rod.
Listeners. Thank you. I look forward to meeting you guys face to face one day. Let's get out on a Turtle Beach. I urge your audience to stay in touch.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. See you on the next one.
All right. Bye-bye.